Now time for the latest political conversation with Joe Coburn. Now time for the latest political conversation with Joe Coburn.
Joining me, former Conservative MEP Daniel Hannan. Joining me, former Conservative MEP Daniel Hannan. TUC General Secretary Francis O'Grady. Writer and broadcaster Timandra Harkness. Founder and CEO of Mumsnet Justine Roberts. And the BBC's political correspondent Jonathan Blake. Today, what does staying local mean?
Obviously, as long as they are staying local within their own mind, they're not interacting, they're not mixing with other people.
The bike ride by the Prime Minister showed there's still some confusion.
We should expect the economy to get...
By the Prime Minister showed there's still some confusion.
We should expect the economy to get worse.
Freedom to return to growth. How?
The risk to our democracy was too big that we felt we had to take the unprecedented step of what is an indefinite ban, and I'm glad we did.
Technology companies have silenced Donald Trump following these scenes in Washington. Should that be cause for celebration or concern? Now, let's start with the front page of the evening. Now, let's start with the front page of the Evening Standard and its headline. So what line are you peddling, Prime Minister? We referred to it there in the headlines. And he's come in for a bit of stick on this, Boris Johnson. His bike ride to the Olympic Park, about 7 miles from Downing Street. Now, exercise is allowed once a day, but you are supposed to stay local. So my question, starting with you, Justine, is should Boris Johnson have done it?
Better. And not socialise under the pretence of exercising, unless it's strictly for mental health reasons, but also that it's a bit silly to obsess about what BJ does, and a bike ride is not that high risk compared to what's being enforced in every bit of the country. But the problem for this government is post-Cummings and what he did, there is a general view that there's one rule for them. So I don't expect this is going away. People will follow Boris Johnson around looking for any tiny indiscretion. It seems a bit of a waste of time, but it's Boris Johnson around looking for any tiny indiscretion. It seems a bit of a waste of time, but it's to be expected, clear and egregious. So I don't think Mumsnetters think that going cycling for 7 miles outside is something and egregious. So I don't think Mumsnetters think that going cycling for 7 miles outside is something that would be worthy of a fine.
Okay.
But it would be worthy of a fine if you were, meeting up with a big group and pretending that was exercise.
To exercise in Boris Johnson's case?
Well, this is the terrible situation that we're in, isn't it? Is where you have to say that absolutely everything you do is necessary and somebody else gets to adjudicate what is necessary. I think we should remember that meeting somebody outside is about an 18th of the risk. So being indoors with somebody is about 18 times as dangerous as meeting somebody outdoors. I think, if anything, we should be encouraging people to meet outdoors because you know what state people in. You don't have to make it. I think, if anything, we should be encouraging people to meet outdoors because you know what state people in. You don't have to make it mental health to say that we're all very demoralised being indoors. The weather's awful. Here we go, another lockdown. And I think actually meeting somebody outdoors for a walk with a coffee in a park is something that should be encouraged to keep our spirits up on that bench. OK, well,
talking of the police, the front page of The Times, police vow to fine the lockdown refuseniks. Francis Cressida-Dick, head of the Metropolitan Police, saying it's preposterous, broadly, that people don't know the rules. They're clear.
Well, I'm not sure many of us would agree, but I think it is worth saying that the vast majority of people do stick by the rules. And I'm not sure many of us would agree, but I think it is worth saying that the vast majority of people do stick by the rules. And that's important because, sometimes you'd open a newspaper and think that none of us were. But I think the key issue here is double exercising, 5 miles from their home. Socially distanced, they surrounded by police, and yet 5 miles from their home, socially distanced, they surrounded by police, and yet a couple of days later he was saying explicitly that a 7-mile bike ride was okay, and obviously that one happened to involve the Prime Minister. But there's a bigger double standards issue, and that's while we're obsessing about what people are doing to exercise outdoors, there's very little attention being given to the millions who are carrying on working indoors. And we've been calling on the government to review our health and safety guidelines that we, alongside employers, were involved in drawing up. But, with the virus spreading so quickly, and now that we know much more about the science, isn't it time to get our heads together and check that those safety standards at work are tough enough and that we've got the enforcement regime to make sure that workers are safe?
All right, Dan, this is an issue, says Francis, about doubling it.
Some people, their average cycle will be much greater than that. Certainly, I know joggers will jog more than that. Some people, their average cycle will be much greater than that. Certainly, I know joggers will jog more than that. I don't know if you're a runner. But if they do, then obviously, as long as they are staying local within their own mind, they're not interacting, they're not mixing with other people, then obviously, and they do it efficiently and quickly and get back, then that is reasonable.
Staying local within their own mind. That's clear, isn't it, Dan?
Yes, and we should use our common sense. Look, yes, I mean, there is something, whenever you have laws, you will end up with sort of silly examples. And we, as a country, seem to be uniquely obsessed with what I think of as the Scotch eggery. Oh, but would I be allowed to do this? Use your bloody nous. Everyone understands what the situation is. Act as though you might be infectious. Don't unnecessarily put other people at risk. If you're outdoors exercising on your own, that is plainly not putting other people at risk. Just treat people as adults and trust people to use a bit of nous.
All right, Jonathan, what's Downing Street's response been to this? Because there has been this ongoing discussion. Are the rules too flexible or are people flexing them too much?
Well, yesterday, Downing Street were happy to confirm in the source I spoke to's words that the Prime Minister had been on a bike ride in Stratford in the Olympic Park. He was obviously spotted. It was reported in the Evening Standard. They didn't want to get into details of how he got there, whether he was driven there or not, but assured us that he had complied with the COVID guidelines. And I think the issue is obviously, as we've been reflecting in the discussion there, the distance travelled between Downing Street, several miles to Stratford, possibly in a car, possibly not. And does that fit with the spirit of the law? No one's really accusing the Prime Minister of breaking the law, but whether it fits with the guidance that goes along with that. And it does state that in England, you should not travel outside your local area. Whether you care or not that Boris Johnson went on a bike ride around the Olympic Park, whether there's a bit of a double standard, as some people, you care or not that Boris Johnson went on a bike ride around the Olympic Park, whether there's a bit of a double standard, as some people see it, compared to the cases such as the 2 women in Derbyshire who were fined, although they've now been rescinded, for driving a few miles away from home and having a walk around a reservoir at such a crucial time when the government is trying so hard to explain how important it is for people to follow the rules.
What about other parts of the UK? Have they also tried to define what sort of staying local means?
They have, and they have been more specific than in England across the board, really. In Wales, the guidance is that exercise should start and finish from your home. And generally should not involve people driving to a location away from home. In Scotland, it is again that you should stay local and the exercise should start and finish in the same place, which can be up to 5 miles of the boundary of your local authority area. And in Northern Ireland, you shouldn't travel more than 10 miles from your home in order to take some exercise. So some specific numbers there, which do make it clearer, I think, than the guidance in England.
Jonathan, this is a tweet from Marcus Rashford, whose successful campaign to continue free school meals for children. This is a tweet from Marcus Rashford, whose successful campaign to continue free school meals for children that need them beyond holiday time. This is a picture of a selection of food. He has tweeted 3 days of food for one family, just not good enough. We don't know exactly where this picture is from. There have been other pictures circulated which say they contain the contents of food parcels that could last for 5 days or 10 days. But there has been a response from the government. Vicky Ford, Conservative MP in the Education Department. I will be looking into this urgently. Food parcels should cover all lunchtime meals and be nutritious. We've increased funding for parcels and will support local vouchers. National Voucher also rolling out ASAP, working night and day on this. Hope your kids are OK. She's responding to at Roadside Mum, who tweeted a slightly different picture. What can you tell us around this?
Well, it's not clear at the moment whether these are a few isolated cases that have been circulating, as you say, online issue, or whether it is something more widespread. But the government saying that it's taking it seriously, looking into it, or whether it is something more widespread. But the government saying that it's taking it seriously, looking into it. As to families whose children normally get free school meals and are home learning at the moment, that's not up and running yet. Families whose children normally get free school meals and are home learning at the moment, that's not up and running yet. What they've done in the meantime is allowed schools, or encouraged schools, to work with their suppliers to provide food parcels for children who normally get those meals, and they've increased the funding that schools can get for that slightly. The company responsible for some of these parcels, not all of them, has said that the funding hasn't come through yet, and they're intending to enhance their hampers later this week to reflect that, but saying the vast majority of cases they've had positive feedback, and they're trying to establish where this incident came from.
Jonathan, thank you very much. We have to let you go at this point. We're going to move on and talk first of all to Justine, who runs Mumsnet, hugely popular online forum for mothers and parents, which, as you can imagine, has been on the site. Very colourful it is too. You can see 2 popular swear words, which I won't repeat. You can substitute what you would like there in the corner. Now, it does show very clearly, Justine, that there was a real spike in stress on the day the government decided to close schools earlier this month. Tell us a bit more.
Well, yes, I mean, absolutely. So I'm not going to repeat those words either, but yeah, they went through the roof, and we've had many comments from many of our users saying that the news that schools were shutting literally has broken them. That's it. And we have surveyed our users, and 3/4 say now that COVID has had a negative impact on their mental health. And the truth of it is that this issue is affecting mothers more than fathers. 8 out of 10 of our users say responsibility for homeschooling has largely fallen to them. And we know from IFS numbers that mothers are able to do just 1/3 of the uninterrupted work that fathers are. So basically, women are picking up the bulk of the responsibility around homeschooling and childcare, and very often trying to hold down a job. We hear stories of our users working, once they've put the kids to bed till midnight and beyond. And I think it's all part of this idea that women have suffered much more from COVID. They tend to be overweight in the sectors that have suffered the most, like hospitality and childcare and caring professions. And they tend to have been furloughed more. They're picking up more of the domestic responsibility. And the worry is that that we go back to where we were in terms of maternal employment. Women are furloughed more, etc., etc. There wasn't a single mention of childcare in Rishi's summer budget either. So the government needs a strategy on this. Our users are really suffering, and if we're not to go back to the 1970s, I think we've got to address it quite quickly, especially during recovery.
Right. Is that how you see it, Timandra? That actually the results of this survey and the research just outlined there does seem to point to a return to 1970s traditional roles?
Well, it does seem to be that women are at the sharp end from whatever way you look at it. So, yeah, exactly as Justine just said. I'm too lazy to have children myself, but I'm getting cabin fever at home, and the flats around me are mostly full of families with young children. I really have no idea how they're coping at all. I do think this is one of the things where closing the schools seems like, oh, well, let's just close the schools and send the kids home, without really thinking of, well, who is going to look after the kids? Who's going to supervise this homeschooling that carries on, even if the kids have access to the technology, which a lot of them don't? And I think that's one of the great mistakes of the strategy over this. It has been closing schools. I think, considering what a low risk this disease poses to children and young people, and even to the majority of teachers who are mostly young and female, which is the medically low risk group, I really think there's absolutely no excuse for closing schools.
And that is, as you say, a result of a policy of closing schools that you don't agree with. But Dan, what about the sort of societal commentary as a response to this? Is it time for fathers to step up, in your view?
Well, I think Justine and Timandra have both made the case extremely well and extremely powerfully. I think there is no... the school closure is the single worst aspect of the lockdown in terms of its knock-on impact on the parents and for the kids, a dent in their development that they may never hammer out. I mean, if you think of what it's like for a small child for whom a month is an eternity, it's now been nearly a year that they've had disruptions of various kinds. The youngest children can't remember an earlier time. And so our priority has to be to reopen the schools. I was against closing the primary schools. Now I felt it was a disproportionate move, given the fact that children don't normally get symptoms and are very unlikely to pass them on. But we need, at the very least, to try and make sure that they come back in half term. And one of the things that I would like to do, if it helps speed that process up, is to prioritise vaccination for school staff, for teachers and non-teaching staff. And by the way, also universities, right? I mean, my own kids range in age from 4 to 18, and they've all been disrupted. You know, the impact on young people of these closures is far more grave, even though in most cases it's a disease that poses next to no risk to them. And so we need to look at ways to bring colleges as well as schools back on tap, ideally this term.
Right, Francis, are there policy levers that can be pulled to make it easier for women if, you know, the schools stay closed for a bit longer?
I think we do need to look at the big picture. You know, we could go on about the absolute chaos and mess with which the education sector has been handled. And I think nurseries in particular, staff and chiefs, feel like they were totally ignored by the Education Secretary. They weren't even mentioned, and many are already on the brink and at risk of closure regardless. So, you know, it's a nightmare for parents, it's a nightmare for staff. But I think we do need to take a harder look at the position that working parents in this country are in. Parental leave, emergency leave, all unpaid. Now, if you're in a low-paid occupation and you haven't got savings, then that's no right at all. So I think we do need to get to grips with creating a much better deal for working parents in this country. And of course, the children who, as you know, others have said, risk missing out now on a whole year, and that will hit children from poorer backgrounds hardest. So we need the government to work with us on a plan for how we're going to help those kids catch up. How do we make sure that in the future, working parents get the support they need? And frankly, I think we're going to have to bail out some nurseries because a lot of them are on the brink.
Dan?
It comes down to what do we prioritise as a society. I think we have exacted far too high a price from young people, above all in the time that can never be given back. And I don't think that is the values that, I mean, talking to, I was doing a kind of paper round for self-isolating elderly people in my village here. They wanted the schools open. They want that to be the priority. That's a good, healthy impulse. And in the meantime, I think we need to be making sure that while schools are closed, there is proper online teaching. And I just want to take this opportunity to plug, because it's a free resource, the Invicta Academy, which offers free online tuition in maths and in English, so that instead of just showing kids a video and then saying, here's a PDF, you've actually got supervised interactive education, which is a critically important part of the experience. But that is all still inadequate. Children need to be with other children. They need to be having the full normal childhood experience, and that means we've got to try and bring schools back this term.
Right, but actually while they're at home, and you've talked, Dan, there about the online learning and the provision that is available, but again, Justine, doesn't the research show that it is women and mothers who are doing a lot of that homeschooling, or that they are in some way facilitating and enabling it?
Absolutely. And we also know that they've been more likely to be furloughed and more likely to be laid off because society assumes it will be women and mothers doing the homeschooling. And I think, this idea of Mumsnet is broadly neutral about, whether we should open or close the schools. But if we are going to close the schools, then we need better provision. We need emergency paid parental leave. We need stronger online provision for across the country. It's so patchy, and much less chopping and changing over policies. So I think it's not that everyone, I'm not necessarily saying that all Mumsneters agree with Dan and that the schools should be open. I think it's a mixed position, and people are very mindful about spreading infection. But if you are going to close the schools, you need to think of the parents who are trying to hold down a job and be teachers. Quite frankly, my homeschool went into special measures in week 1, so I needed decent online learning provision, and so does everyone else. Right,
well, there's a plea, a heartfelt plea there from Justine. Francis, what's your response generally, though, to the idea that women have borne the brunt of this?
Well, it's evidently true. I mean, back in September, the TUC did a survey that showed that 1 in 6 women were cutting their hours and therefore pay because of the nursery closures and school closures they were facing. So it was women bearing the brunt. And it's really important that the government reminds employers that, look, we need maximum flexibility during this time. And in many cases, decent employers and unions have come up with agreements to provide that flexibility. But if all else fails, the furlough scheme does cover working parents who have lost childcare. So we need to get the government communicating that to employers more strongly. You can use the furlough scheme, so at least women in particular have some money in their pockets and some flexibility in terms of work and childcare.
Right. I mean, Timandra, are you concerned that the pandemic has forced women to, it seems, reoccupy more traditional roles of childcare, maybe to the detriment of their careers?
Yeah, definitely. I think that there's a lot of evidence showing that women working at home are less productive than men working at home. But I am wary of making this a kind of men against women question. I think that the effect of the pandemic and of the measures that we've taken against the pandemic have been very detrimental to everybody. I mean, let's not forget that, women are more likely to take the brunt at home and more likely to lose their jobs. Again, there's a lot of evidence for that. But men are more likely to die. So I don't think we should see this as necessarily falling all on women when men are more likely to die of the disease. Let's get some balance about this. I think we really need to think in terms of the whole of society. How is the whole of society going to recover from this? How are we going to get back to a situation where anybody can combine a career with raising a family and continue to... how can we get back to some kind of a normal, productive life that doesn't confine people to their homes, whether that's for childcare or simply because we are indefinitely supposed to stay at home to avoid a disease?
Justine, briefly?
Briefly, I think that we need to think about where we come out from here, and there has to be meaningful representation of women at the highest level. We've already got a gender pay gap. We've already got woeful amounts of women in senior positions in big companies, and it's going to go backwards. So the government needs a strategy, and they need women at the centre of that strategy. And it is, very noticeable that there are very few women amongst government spokespeople during this whole thing. Very few senior women in the cabinet, and that's why things like childcare don't even get noticed in the summer statement. So that's what needs to happen. They need a strategy.
All right, well, let's stick with the economy more broadly, because the Chancellor, Rishi Sunak, was in Parliament yesterday setting out the impact that the coronavirus crisis is having. Let's take a look.
Coronavirus has already caused significant harm to our economy. The scale of this impact bears repeating. GDP fell by 18.8% in the second quarter of 2020. Even with the significant economic support we've provided, over 800,000 people have lost their job since February.
So Rishi Sunak also saying it's going to get worse before it gets better, setting out the scale of the economic crisis that we're in. Dan, you've written an article for the Conservative Home website. We're showing our viewers here, setting out a possible solution, which is, your headline, Britain is skint, so we should use our post-EU freedom to grow ourselves out of this mess. What are you suggesting?
Well, you just heard the Chancellor setting out the problem there. We've suffered a sharper contraction of our economy than we suffered in any equivalent period during the two world wars or during the Great Depression. And for the next 2, 3, 4, 5 years coming out of this, the only issue in politics and in economic policy is going to be tackling the unemployment crisis, ensuring that we're creating jobs. And so we need to focus on making sure that businesses can invest, businesses can hire, because all of the other things we want to do depend on having the resources that will come from people being in the employment world and paying their taxes rather than being outside it. And so we need to look at where were there decisions that were imposed by the European Union that we opposed, that were opposed, by business and by groups across the UK, that we can now do differently, because we can now tailor policy more specifically to our own conditions and needs.
All right, and you talk about deregulation or specific EU regulations that you'd like to see scrapped. For example, one of them is the Temporary Workers Directive. But there is a point to these directives and regulations. I mean, this one is meant to protect the rights of temporary workers. So why would you want to get rid of it?
That's what they said, yeah. I mean, because there were really only 2 EU countries that had a big temping sector, us and the Netherlands. And the temping companies in the UK and the Netherlands fiercely opposed this rule, but it was kind of because we were the minority, as usually happens. A regulation came in that was aimed at the EU average rather than at every country in it. Temping was the usual path pre-COVID for people to find work. It's the way in which people found full-time employment, and we should be looking at ways that facilitate people getting into work. There's no point in having notional rights for workers if you don't have work. The priority has to be to make sure that people get the chance to have it.
Right. Well, I'm sure Francis is desperate to come in. I mean, would you admit, Francis, though, that getting rid of something like, for example, the Temporary Workers Directive and perhaps other EU rules, as suggested by Dan, will save businesses money and they will hire more people?
Well, there's no evidence whatsoever that making life worse for working people improves growth and productivity. On the contrary. Of course, this is a government that promised in its manifesto that it would give the biggest upgrade to workers' rights seen in a generation. So, and they're doing that because what we know is, and it's been exposed by the pandemic, is just how many people, millions of people in Britain who are on 0 hours contracts, agency, temporary, and how often that is about low paid exploitative work, including, of course, amongst our key workers. Look at how many care workers, majority women, who are on 0 hours or agency contracts and ended up unwittingly spreading that virus between homes. So, we need to get a grip and realise we can't just go back to business as usual. There has to be a focus on good green growth in the parts of the country that need them most. That means investment, and the TUC has been arguing hard for investment in green tech, transport, but also manufacturing, where we need to start building domestic supply chains to get round what, frankly, is a bit of a shoddy deal with the EU, in that it's just created a mountain of red tape which drives up costs and at the end of the day risks jobs.
Right. Well, Dan, Francis contradicts your claim that actually cutting EU regulations will actually provide more productivity and growth.
Well, there's a lot of evidence that removing obstacles between businesses and their customers encourages them to take on more people. We're not talking about taking away basic rights from anybody. I mean, those didn't come from the EU. Barbara Castle introduced equal pay for women before we joined. Neville Chamberlain, as Chancellor of the Exchequer, introduced holidays with pay. That's not what we're talking about. What I would like to see is where UK interests were steamrolled when EU directives and regulations were put forward. We can now come back. So a good example would be the fine arts market, right? London is competing really with New York and Hong Kong. It is subject to a bunch of rules on droit de suite, on VAT and stuff that were opposed pretty much unanimously by the industry. We can now do something differently. And there's no point in taking back the freedom to regulate ourselves if we don't do it in a way that will generate
Francis?
Is this about ripping up workers' rights, or is this about enhancing them? We've been long promised an employment bill from this government. It's been kicked into the long grass. I don't know whether Daniel knows when we're finally going to see it. But this, if levelling up means anything, then it's got to be about ensuring that everybody has the right to a decent job with decent rights, including, of course, the right to join a union, and that it means something. You know, you can't have hordes of particularly women and young people on these precarious contracts, and poverty pay is no way to run a country. We've got to do better in the future.
Timandra, listening to this debate, I mean, I think everyone pretty well agrees we need to grow the economy. We need to grow our way out of COVID. Which viewpoint do you think will work best in terms of recovery from this crisis?
Well, I don't think I would necessarily go wholeheartedly with either Dan or Francis. I think it is true that workers' rights in the UK have been above the minimum standard ones in the EU, so I don't think we have an immediate worry on that front, but that's not to say they're good enough, and certainly trade unions should be working hard to get precarious and temporary workers better rights. And we have seen the impact in the pandemic of people in insecure and low-paid employment not self-isolating when they're infectious. And I have no idea why the government have not gone in hard and said, you cannot sack somebody who's self-isolating. We're going to pay them proper sick pay, because sick pay, we are well below the rest of Europe. So I think there's a lot to be done in terms of workers' rights. But I think in general, yes, we could say we are now free of EU regulations. It's up to us to pick a direction. Personally, I would say we do need a lot more investment in technology, for example, and that is something where the government could step in. We're one of the least mechanised countries in Europe for farming, for example, because we've relied on low-paid workers. So there's a lot we could do to raise productivity, and I think that's a long-term problem that has preceded both COVID and Brexit, and we really need to sort it out.
Justine, just before I come to you, Dan, you also argue in that article that the crisis, the pandemic, shows that the private sector has and can succeed where the state fails. Why? Dan. Hang on, Dan, we just missed you at the beginning there. Your sound was down, so try again.
OK, so it's never a popular point to make, but yes, the private sector stepped up. Tesco kept its shelves stacked, Amazon kept us supplied, Pfizer found the vaccine, and we kind of take that for granted. We just assume that that's what happens. We don't go out and applaud them on a Thursday. But actually, you know, just stop for a moment and think of the extraordinary logistical challenges that they just quietly got on with. And I know that the mood now is, you know, oh, windfall tax them and no one should have been allowed to have made a profit and so on. I think that would be a fine way to thank the companies that kept us going through this awful time. They alone have the muscle mass to drag us out of the recession as the lockdown ends.
Right. Justine, what do you make of that?
I suppose I think, yes, unless they're providing free school meals that are meant to cost £15 and look like they're putting £5 in the free school meal. But so I do think there needs to be oversight. I mean, Mumsnet's a small business, and I'm sympathetic with this idea. I mean, 80% of our cost is staff. And if we had to pay lower employment taxes, we would hire more people and we would grow faster. So I'm definitely sympathetic that if you're going to look at taxation, then taxes on employment are probably the first place to start. However, our users are concerned about losing employment rights and protections, particularly around maternity discrimination, which many have suffered and are suffering more during this pandemic. And there is an irony, isn't there, that probably the biggest cause of friction for business at the moment is Brexit and all the red tape associated with that, and actually sorting that out is probably the quickest and simplest thing that government can do to boost the economy right now.
We're going to leave it there and move on to Donald Trump, who is still president and commander-in-chief of the world's largest military, but he can no longer tweet, which is obviously a big deal for the man who used to use Twitter regularly. Here it is, in fact, Donald J. Trump, you can see with his 88.7 million followers, account suspended. And at the moment, he can't post on Facebook either. That's after both Twitter and Facebook accused him of violating their policies. But their decisions have actually caused some concern. Let's just show you the Financial Times. Angela Merkel, the German Chancellor, attacks Twitter over Trump ban, and underneath says Russian dissident Alexei Navalny echoes criticisms levelled by German Chancellor's spokesman. Timandra, was Twitter's decision problematic? Is it a breach of the fundamental right to free speech?
I think it reflects a much broader problem that we have today, which is that the public sphere, if you like, the space of public debate, has become largely the possession of a few large companies based mostly in California, certainly based mostly in America. And we've slid into that without really noticing, because it was great to have these free forums that anybody could join, and from Donald Trump down to absolutely anybody, you could join on sort of an equal footing. You could have your say. It was up to you to build up your followers and so on. And there's been some dispute for a while over, are these people publishers, or is it just literally a public forum like a public square? And I think we're now finding out that, like any private space, at some point the people who run it are going to say, actually, you can't say that here. Trump was suspended for glorifying violence. The particular tweets they cite, I think that they say themselves, it's about the context in which they were taken. So that's a whole other discussion. But I think it is very telling that Merkel and Navalny are amongst the people saying, do we really want private companies to be the ones who decide what can be said in public space? Okay. And although people have said it's like having a private club, you're perfectly at liberty to say what can be said there. The idea of a private club is if you don't like it or if they don't like you, you can go and start your own club. But that clearly is not the case here because, for example, Parler, which was a social media site with much looser regulation, has been, Amazon withdrew their hosting, so they just disappeared, and Apple and Google had already dropped them from their app stores. So we have to say, if somebody is going to regulate public speech, do we want it to be unelected companies? All right, well, on that point, Timandra, Justine, I'm just going to show our viewers the pictures, remind them of the siege of people, protesters, rioters outside the Capitol building, which, of course, they broke into, and there were several arrests and also several people died. Many people will think it's justified, the action taken by, yes, private companies.
Yes, I mean, I agree with Tamara. The idea that these big tech platforms haven't been making editorial decisions for some time is crazy. I mean, Facebook used to take pictures of breastfeeding women off their site and have been making decisions like that for years. But in this particular instance, so I think that's the reality, and that's the reality we're in. And in this particular instance, I think Twitter probably were right. Here was a guy who had lost an election and was continually using his voice on Twitter to discredit that result and to drum up incitement. If I'd been sitting on that Twitter board, I would have definitely voted to silence him. But I understand it is problematic. There is tremendous amount of power and very little oversight. And what is very true is these companies have for years pretended that they are dumb pipes, just platforms, and yet they have been making editorial decisions. So I think government needs to get to grips with that. We at Mumsnet have, been upfront. We moderate. We have a kind of philosophy that it's meant to make parents' lives easier, and if it doesn't, we will remove people and we will remove posts that don't. So, it's just a question of honesty and facing up to the fact that they are making those kind of decisions all the time. In this case, though, I think it was the right one.
Dan?
Well, the last time I was on your programme was just before the US election, and I said that Conservatives shouldn't vote for Trump because he was fundamentally unfit for office, because he couldn't recognise that he was passing through a bigger office than he was. And his subsequent actions have completely vindicated that. He's behaved abominably, and the insurrectionists should feel the full force of the law.
Right, but just briefly, Dan, because you're referring... I'm sorry, just to interrupt, because you're referring to when you were last on. In September, I think you wrote a comment piece for The Telegraph where you argued that a second Trump term would be better for the UK than a Biden presidency. So you do think differently now?
No, I don't think differently. I said, I'm sure you wouldn't have just quoted that piece without reading it, Joe. If you read it, you'll have seen that I said I would not vote for Trump. You know,
you did.
No, I said if I was an American, there's no way I would vote for him.
No, you were no fan.
Yeah.
But I think you did argue that it would be better for the UK than a Biden presidency. That was the bit.
Nonetheless, I wouldn't have voted for him. He would have been on the narrow issue of a trade deal. We were further advanced with him. But nonetheless, his character flaws disqualify him from office. This mafia-like insistence that he be followed on his own account. So I know I've been both in 2016 and in 2020. I write a column in a broadly pro-Trump, or maybe not pro-Trump, but a more warm towards him than some paper in the US. And I've taken the line there all the way through this. You know, the Republicans should not go down this road.
OK, so returning then to the substantive issue about whether Mark Zuckerberg and other powerful individuals in Silicon Valley should be the ones deciding who can tweet or post.
So I think they are making a real mistake. They may have the right to exclude whomever they want. In that sense, I think that the club metaphor is fine, right? I think businesses should be allowed to refuse custom to people, and they're not a utility like an electricity company. But I think that choosing to exercise that right in this way is a real mistake. A huge part of their argument, all the way. I mean, I was often getting representations from them in my old job in Brussels. They would say, we are only a platform, we're only a frame, we're not responsible for what's put inside the frame, we can't be made liable for it. Now they cannot make that argument again. They've made a decision to go way beyond what the law requires, and not, because of course they have to comply with laws on incitement and so on. They've made a political judgment. And once they do, they may have the right to take that decision, but I think it is a huge mistake because they're now in the game of editorializing.
Francis?
Well, we live in a world where unemployment, and remember, we're facing mass unemployment in the UK with the OBR predicting 2.6 million by the middle of next year. And gross inequality is a breeding ground for the far right, neo-fascism, from the Proud Boys through to Britain First. And so what happens on social media has real world consequences. Some people may remember there was a particular site that targeted trade unionists, which ended up with one of our union leaders being attacked on his doorstep because it posted photographs and home addresses and incited violence. So I think the principle is that we all want freedom, but it cannot include freedom to harm others. It cannot include neo-fascism, which is fundamentally anti-democratic, nor can it include white supremacism. And we saw so many of those flags being paraded in that insurrection.
OK.
So my concern is who polices the police. These big tech companies have huge political as well as industrial power.
All right.
And we need firm and fair regulation so that they play by the rules too.
Timandra, we only have about 30 seconds or so, but yes, would you like to respond?
Well, I think there are already laws against incitement to violence and threats, which I think is right. In terms of, who defines what is neo-fascism and what is a legitimate right-wing view? I think this is the problem when you want to police speech. In terms of the tech companies, I think we should go back to Tony Benn's 5 questions that you ask of anyone with power. What power have you got? Where did you get it from? In whose interest do you exercise it? To whom are you accountable? How do we get rid of you? And I think if you ask those questions to Mark Zuckerberg and Jack Dorsey at Twitter and all the social media companies, we wouldn't like the answers.
Right. I mean, just finally, a few words, Justine? Oh, no, I think we've run out of time. That's my fault there. Thank you. You're saved there, Justine. Thank you to all of our guests. As you can see, the full story of what happened in Washington last Wednesday by watching America storming the Capitol, available on iPlayer now. And we'll be back tomorrow at 11:15. Bye-bye.